The forbidden technique that awakens your soul's true memory for centuries. Whispers moved through the shadows of history, too soft for the loud world to hear, too bright for the eyes conditioned to darkness. It wasn't a myth, nor was it ever a fabrication of mystics with overactive imaginations. It was real. A technique so ancient, so potent, that it became dangerous not because it brought chaos, but because it brought liberation. Imagine this, buried beneath centuries of noise, behind rituals emptied of meaning and scriptures rearranged for control. There exists a key, not a key made of metal or shaped like anything you can hold, but a vibrational key of frequency. And that frequency doesn't open doors made by men. It opens the gateway to the most sacred vault imaginable, the memory of your soul. This technique doesn't teach you anything new. It does not pretend to give you something you don't already have. That's why it was hidden. It doesn't feed the illusion of lack. It dissolves it. It doesn't build towers of belief. It returns you to stillness. And that stillness is what power fears most. You see, the greatest deception ever performed wasn't to make us ignorant. It was to make us believe we were something we're not. It wasn't to lock knowledge away, it was to bury memory beneath layers of false identity so thick. We began to mistake the mask for the face. But what if today you remembered? What if, instead of reaching for answers in books and doctrines and other people's voices, you turned inward and found a voice inside you that never left. That voice, ancient, unshaken, subtle, is still there. Covered, perhaps, dimmed, but never absent. And the technique you are about to remember, not learn, is the way back to it. Let's begin by lifting the first veil, the assumption that remembering is an intellectual act. It is not. Memory, the kind we're speaking of here, doesn't live in the brain. It lives in the vibration of your being. It pulses like a hidden rhythm underneath your skin, like a song that once played in the background of your soul's earliest dreams. And this song, it hasn't stopped. It's just been drowned out by the noise. To hear it again, we don't need to add anything new. We need to unadd. We need to subtract, detach, remove. And in that sacred act of letting go, the technique begins. This is not a theory. It is not a metaphor. It is not philosophy for the sake of thought. This is experience direct, raw, irreducible. If you're still reading these words, it means something within you is already stirring. Perhaps it never truly slept. Perhaps it was waiting for the exact alignment of now. The ancient schools of wisdom knew this. They didn't need textbooks or podiums. They used silence, ritual, breath, symbols, and they guided the few who were ready through the great undoing. In Egypt, initiates entered the house of life not to learn, but to forget what wasn't true. They were laid to rest not in death, but in initiation, and their consciousness, guided by a master, would travel through layers of reality until the soul remembered its origin. When they awoke, they had crossed a veil that could not be uncrossed. In Greece, Orphic initiates described the body not as a prison, but as a temporary forgetting. Through chants, breathwork, and trance, they created windows in the walls of form, glimpses of the divine they had always carried but rarely seen. In India, the rishis taught smarana, not studying the truth, but recalling it, not building the soul, but removing the dust that clouded it. Across these cultures, separated by oceans and eras, a singular thread shimmered beneath the surface. The soul already knows, and more radically, the soul cannot be taught. It can only be remembered, and that changes everything. What does it mean to live from remembrance rather than pursuit? What does it feel like to stop chasing and start resonating? It means silence begins to feel like home again. It means your mind no longer dominates your attention, but bows to your deeper knowing. It means you stop needing permission to be who you've always been. But here's the truth most won't tell you. Awakening isn't gentle. It breaks you open. It strips away. It places you face to face with every illusion you've clung to. Because the soul, your true self, is not polite. It is honest. And honesty is fire. That's why this technique was hidden. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. Because the soul that remembers cannot be manipulated, cannot be frightened, cannot be governed by fear or seduced by false promises. A soul that remembers doesn't seek liberation, it is liberation. So what is this technique? Truly, it is not a single ritual, nor a series of intellectual steps. It is a way of aligning your breath, body, intention, and vibration until your original melody begins to play again. You are not learning notes, you are removing the static. You are not adding light, you are clearing away the dust on the window. In the sections ahead, we will walk this path together, gently, layer by layer. We'll begin with the deprogramming of the false self. Then, we will awaken the inner sense, the one not tied to emotion or logic, but to truth. And finally, we'll reach the sacred moment when you feel, not think. Your true name, a resonance so real it shatters doubt like glass. But for now, breathe. Let this be the first gesture of remembrance. Not a breath to survive, not a breath to escape, a breath to return. Before anything can be remembered, something must first be forgotten, and not just anything but the lie. For most of your life, you've worn masks without realizing. Not because you're a fraud, but because the world taught you to be one. You were handed names, roles, beliefs, expectations, and they came not with questions, but with certainty. You didn't get to ask, is this truly me? You were told, this is who you are. Be it. And so you were. But beneath that performance, beneath the personality you call I, there has always been something watching. A stillness, a witness. It never shouted. It never competed. It simply waited. Because it knew that at some point, all masks begin to crack. That's where the first phase of the forbidden technique begins, the deprogramming of the false self. This phase is not glamorous. It's not mystical in appearance. It doesn't require exotic rituals or distant temples. It requires something far more difficult, radical honesty. You begin by observing, deeply, relentlessly. You watch your thoughts not to follow them, but to question them. Is this mine? Or was it installed? When you feel fear, you ask, whose fear is this? Where did I learn to tremble at that? When you speak, you pause. Do these words come from my essence? Or am I echoing someone else's script? You begin to peel back the layers, and layer by layer, you see that the identity you've protected, defended, and invested in for so long was never really you. It was a collage of reactions, a defense mechanism, a survival suit, useful, perhaps, for navigating a world that demands masks, but suffocating. If mistaken for truth, you were not born afraid. You were taught to fear. You were not born ashamed. You were taught to hide. You were not born fragmented. You were told who to be in pieces. The soul doesn't speak in fragments. It speaks in vibration, wholeness, presence. So how do you unlearn? Not by attacking the false self, not by waging war with your ego, but by seeing, deep, consistent seeing, because what is seen clearly loses its power to deceive. That's why many avoid this stage. Because seeing requires stillness, and in stillness, the truth emerges, not the one you read in books, but the one your soul already knows. And that truth isn't always flattering. It shows you where you've lied to yourself, where you've clung to illusion, where you've sought validation from mirrors that never reflected your real face. It is uncomfortable, but necessary. Because no seed becomes a tree without first splitting open. No truth reveals itself while you're still attached to comfort. The false self doesn't die easily. It bargains. It adapts. It hides within spiritual language. It even pretends to seek awakening so long as it gets to stay in control. But it cannot survive under the light of remembrance. This technique teaches you to sit with your discomfort, to feel it fully, not to analyze it away, because every uncomfortable emotion is a doorway not to something wrong, but to something buried. And when you open that door without judgment, what walks through is not darkness, it's your own lost light. To help in this process, you're not left empty-handed. You're given tools, not external, but internal. One such tool is the observer's gaze. This is the act of watching your mind, your emotions, your reflexes with a kind of sacred detachment. Not indifference, but clarity. You say to yourself, this thought is arising, this emotion is pulsing, but I am not it. I am the one seeing it, and slowly a gap opens between what arises and what you are. In that gap, power returns. Another tool is inquiry through stillness. When a belief appears, instead of reacting or debating, you meet it with silence and ask it to show you its roots. Not mentally, but vibrationally. You feel into it. You listen with your body, and the truth always has a frequency, and the body knows when something resonates. It tightens when a lie is spoken. It softens when truth is near. This is not about being perfect, it's about being real. The goal of this phase is not to destroy the ego, it's to see it, to recognize it as a tool, not a master, a map, not the terrain. As you continue this practice, something begins to shift. A voice inside you, once quiet, begins to speak more clearly. It says things like, "This isn't yours. You never wanted this. That belief doesn't fit you anymore. That fear is not your truth." And you listen. And as you listen, the false self starts to dissolve, not through force, but through irrelevance. You don't fight illusions when you remember who you are. You simply stop feeding them. Let this be your first fire of remembrance. Not one that burns to punish, but one that clarifies. A flame held steady in the temple of your heart, illuminating all the places you forgot to look. You are not here to become someone else. You are here to remove what you never truly were. This is the sacred unraveling. This is the beginning of remembrance. Once the veils of the false self begin to loosen, something stirs beneath them, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably real. It's a sense you've carried all your life, though it rarely had a name. It's not vision, not hearing, not feeling in the emotional sense. It's something deeper, a knowing without thought, a clarity without logic, a perception that doesn't arrive from the outside, but awakens from within. This is your inner sense, what ancient initiates called direct perception. And the second phase of the forbidden technique is its awakening. You may have brushed against it in moments of sin, in dreams you couldn't explain, or during times of deep awe when the world suddenly felt both vast and strangely familiar. This sense is the organ of your soul's memory, and it doesn't speak in words, it speaks in symbols, sensations, and presence. But here's the paradox. You don't force it awake. You tune into it. To understand this, imagine your inner world as a vast space filled with faint frequencies. Most of the time, your attention is caught by the loudest signals, the constant mental chatter, the demands of the body, the echo of emotional tides. But beneath all that is a subtle vibration, always humming. It's been there since before you had language. It's the place you came from and the place you'll return to. The technique does not give you this sense. It helps you remember how to hear it again. So how do you tune in? It begins with mindful breathing, but not just any breath. This is breath not taken for survival, not managed by unconscious habit, but performed as a sacred act. Each inhale becomes a return. Each exhale a release. You are not breathing to alter reality, you are breathing to remember it. With each slow breath, your attention returns to the body not as flesh and bone, but as a temple. And in this temple, silence becomes sacred, stillness becomes alive. And in that stillness, your inner sense begins to rise. The technique guides you through this space using rituals of silence, not elaborate, not theatrical, but intentional. You sit, you breathe, you observe, and you allow whatever arises to pass through you like wind through a field. Then come the symbols. In ancient traditions, symbols were not decorations. They were living gateways. You don't invent them, you receive them. Through focused imagination, not fantasy, but intention, you begin to visualize. A lotus blooming at your heart, a flame at the center of your forehead, a mirror in the core of your chest reflecting only what is real. These are not mere metaphors. Used with devotion, they become activation codes because your soul speaks in image and vibration. And when it sees itself mirrored in these timeless forms, it begins to awaken, not as an idea, but as an experience. This is where the technique becomes mystical, not because it's detached from reality, but because it reveals the hidden dimensions of it. You begin to feel presences, not entities from outside, but lost parts of you, qualities you once had. Lifetimes ago that begin to emerge as familiarity. You recognize love not as a feeling, but as a state of being. You touch peace, not as a concept, but as a frequency in your spine. You notice trust, not as a decision, but as a presence standing quietly in your breath. You don't chase these things, you remember them. This is the stage where the boundary between inner and outer begins to blur. You'll be walking through the world and suddenly you'll feel a message not spoken, not shown, but known. You'll sense the subtle shift of energy in a room. You'll meet a person and know what they're carrying without a word exchanged. Your inner sense begins to lead your perception, not follow it. This doesn't mean you lose your rational mind. It means your rational mind takes its rightful place not as master, but as servant to a deeper wisdom. And here, another truth is revealed. What you imagine with devotion, the soul accepts as real. This is not fantasy, it's alchemy. When you focus on a sacred image, say, a beam of light descending from above into your heart, your soul doesn't ask, is this scientifically accurate? It asks, is this true in essence? And if your intention is clear, it responds. That imagined light becomes a memory. That visualized flame becomes warmth. That internal mirror begins to reflect the face you forgot you had. This is why the technique has always been practiced in secret, because in the wrong hands, imagination becomes delusion. But in awakened hands, imagination becomes initiation. You begin to walk differently. You begin to listen with your skin. You start to speak not from your thoughts, but from your presence. and slowly the veil thins. Your outer life may look the same. You still pay bills, you still speak to others, but internally everything has changed. You are no longer reacting from noise. You are responding from resonance. Let us pause here, just for a moment. Let your breath become your focus again. Inhale not to take in the world, but to return to yourself. Exhale not to push anything away, but to surrender what was never truly yours. Your inner sense is not something you earn. It's who you were before forgetting. This is how you awaken it, not with effort, but with sacred attention. And this is only the beginning. There are truths so ancient, so intimate, that they were never written down, not because they were forgotten, but because they were too sacred for ink. Among those truths, whispered across mystery schools and buried in symbolic language, is this: every soul carries a name, not a name to be spoken, but a vibration to be remembered. This name is not John or Sarah or any word shaped by the tongue. It is not the label given to you at birth, nor the one etched on paper. Your true name cannot be found in language. It can only be felt. It resonates in the core of your being, an echo that, when activated, makes all falsehood crumble and all truth become self-evident. This is the third phase of the technique, resonance with the true name. To understand this, imagine yourself as an instrument and your true name as a tone that, when struck, makes the entire instrument vibrate in perfect harmony. For most, that tone has long been muffled by layers of dissonance, external beliefs, inherited fear, trauma, and noise. But beneath the clutter, that vibration remains pure, untouched, waiting to be remembered not with the mind, but through alignment. How do you approach such resonance? Not by trying to figure it out. The soul doesn't operate on deduction. It responds to invitation. And this invitation begins with a sacred posture, not of the body to be, but of the self. You become quiet, not just in sound, but in identity. You surrender, not to weakness, but to clarity. You begin to live not as someone trying to become, but as someone listening to what already is. There are no mantras to chant that will reveal this name. No teacher can hand it to you. No book can define it. But when you align body, breath, energies, and consciousness in a state of inner stillness and devotion, something begins to stir. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It's a recognition, a feeling of coming home, not to a place, but to yourself. And in that moment, however brief, you realize, I've always been this. I just forgot. The forbidden technique in this phase works like a tuner. It doesn't impose a new identity. It removes what doesn't belong. Thought patterns, fears, labels, wounds, they begin to fall away, not because you force them to leave, but because they no longer resonate. And what remains is you, the you that never needed fixing, only remembering. Some describe this moment as standing before a cosmic mirror that does not reflect your face, but your essence. Others feel it as a deep pulse in the center of their chest or a hum in their spine. There are no universal symptoms, only the same realization. This is me. I've always known this. I've always been this. It's not a memory in the narrative sense. It's not an event you recall. It's a frequency that floods your field with clarity. From this point on, your relationship with the world begins to shift. Not because the world changes, but because you vibrate differently. You speak more softly, but with more power. You move more slowly, but with more certainty. You begin to see through layers of others, not with judgment, but with understanding. Their masks, their pain, their forgetting all become visible, not as something foreign, but as something you once carried. This is where compassion becomes natural. not as a virtue to be cultivated, but as a byproduct of remembrance. You see yourself in others, not their surface self, but their hidden light. The resonance with your true name is not an escape. It's not a trance. It's not spiritual entertainment. It's a shift in center. You no longer live from your wounds. You live from your origin. And yet this resonance must be cared for. It's not a one-time revelation. It's a flame. And like all sacred fires, it needs tending. The winds of habit, fear, distraction, they will try to put it out. That's why this technique, though ancient, is still alive. Because it teaches not just how to awaken the fire, but how to shelter it. You protect this resonance not by hiding it, but by honoring it in daily life. When you speak, speak from it. When you walk, walk with it. When you face hardship, face it through it. Even when you forget, and you will come back. Sit again. Breathe again. Remember again. Because this is not about being perfect, it's about being real. And nothing is more real than the moment you feel your true name ringing inside you, not like a word, but like a sunrise behind your ribs. And when that vibration is felt, it begins to guide your life in ways no plan or strategy ever could. Opportunities appear not as chance, but as response. People arrive not as coincidence, but as mirrors. Life begins to echo you, not the false you, but the one that finally remembered its own sound. Let us pause once more, not to reflect, but to return. Close your eyes, if you wish. Place your attention on your breath, not to control it, but to accompany it. Inhale. And imagine that breath carrying you back to your true name. Exhale, and let it sweep away everything that does not belong. You don't need to know the name in words. You only need to feel when it calls you home. There is a moment, subtle yet undeniable, when remembrance becomes more than a glimpse, it becomes a home. Not a momentary spark, not a sacred coincidence, but a state of being. You no longer visit your soul like a distant temple, you begin to live from it. This is where the technique ceases to feel like a practice and starts to become life itself. And from this shift emerges a new way of being in the world. Not as someone trying to awaken, but as someone who has remembered and now walks differently. In this phase, you begin to see clearly that awakening was never meant to be an escape. It was meant to be a return, a coming back to the ordinary with extraordinary presence. You still live, you still breathe, eat, speak, move, meet people, but each of these acts becomes infused with depth, colored with awareness. Even the smallest gesture, a glance, a word, a breath carries the imprint of the sacred. This is the fourth movement of the forbidden technique, living in the state of remembrance. But what does that look like? It looks like silence becoming your favorite teacher, not silence as absence, but silence as a presence deeper than words. You begin to crave not distraction, but clarity, not stimulation, but stillness. And in that stillness, wisdom flows not as knowledge, but as recognition. You begin to notice time moving differently, not in clock hours, but in sensation. Moments stretch, contract, dissolve. You may find yourself staring at a tree or a cup of tea and feeling as if you're remembering a lifetime in that moment, because you are. The soul remembers through symbols, and life, when seen from remembrance, is nothing but a living tapestry of symbols. You don't need to leave your job or abandon your responsibilities. The soul doesn't demand you become a monk on a mountain. It asks only this: can you bring presence to what you are already doing? Can you carry the vibration of remembrance into the kitchen, the office, the street, the silence between words. Because once remembrance awakens, everything becomes a ritual. Walking becomes a pilgrimage. Eating becomes a communion. Speaking becomes a form of blessing or silence. And listening becomes sacred. You begin to feel others not through their personalities, but through their energy. Their vibration becomes more telling than their words. And compassion arises, not because you're trying to be good, but because your soul recognizes its own fragmentation in theirs. You stop reacting, and you start responding not with answers, but with presence. This is the paradox of awakening. It makes you more human, not less. It doesn't remove emotion, it deepens your relationship with it. You feel more fully. You cry more deeply. But you no longer identify with these waves. You become the ocean in which they rise and fall. In this state, relationships transform. You no longer enter them to fill a void, to complete a story, or to escape yourself. You meet others from your center. Not to take, but to share, not to fix, but to witness. And even conflict begins to feel different, not something to avoid, but a mirror that reveals where your vibration is still unclear. This phase is also where your sense of purpose begins to shift. You stop chasing meaning as something to find. Instead, meaning arises from how you do everything. It's not about a grand mission. It's about the depth with which you live this moment. And here is where many begin to feel a kind of grief. Because in living from remembrance, you start to lose interest in what once fascinated you. You detach not out of boredom, but because certain patterns simply no longer resonate. Old conversations become exhausting. Old roles begin to feel like costumes that no longer fit. The world continues its dance of noise. But you no longer feel pulled into every step. You're not better. You're simply elsewhere inward. You begin to observe your own mind like a landscape. Thoughts rise like weather. Emotions flow like rivers, but none of it defines you. You become the witness who knows the sky exists beyond the clouds. And yet, you remain in the world. You still laugh. You still bleed. But now there is a dimension of stillness beneath it all, a calm awareness that doesn't abandon you. Even in chaos. This is what makes the technique both sacred and dangerous, not because it harms, but because it changes everything. Once you've lived from remembrance, the old games of control, status, competition, and validation lose their grip. You no longer seek to be seen because you already see yourself. You stop chasing love because you've remembered that you are love. But here lies the sacred responsibility to sustain the fire, to not let it become a memory, to tend it daily, moment by moment, through attention. So how do you keep remembrance alive? You practice active silence a few minutes each day, where you return to your center. Not to do, but to be. You make your actions ceremonial, not grand, but conscious. Washing a cup becomes a prayer. Touching a leaf becomes a meditation. You guard your attention not out of fear, but reverence. You choose what you expose your senses to, knowing that your vibration is your temple. You speak less but with more depth. Words become fewer, but they carry weight. You speak from truth, or not at all. And finally, you walk as if you already are who your soul remembers. Not pretending, not performing, but embodying. As if your very breath carries the memory of lifetimes. Because it does. And if you fall because you will, you return. Again and again. With grace, with forgiveness, with presence. This is not a path of perfection. It is a path of remembering. And remembrance, once lit, becomes the flame that walks with you everywhere, even in the dark. There is a moment, often quiet and unmarked, when a soul realizes it has crossed a threshold, not a line visible to the eye, but one felt in the very structure of being, a threshold where something ancient within you no longer asks, "Who am I?" Because it already knows. You do not arrive at this place through belief. You arrive by remembrance. The final phase of this journey, the sixth and most sacred, is not about reaching higher. It is about returning deeper. This is the invitation to return, not to your past, not to your old self, but to the eternal center that was always there, before the world named you. And here's the truth. You were never truly disconnected. You only closed your eyes to the thread. The thread was always there. Every silence you feared, every longing you couldn't explain, every dream that lingered like a scent from another life, they were all signs, echoes, whispers. They were the soul calling you back to where it never stopped singing. But here's where remembrance becomes more than a personal blessing. It becomes a responsibility, because a soul that has remembered cannot know what it has seen. And such a soul begins to transform the world not with preaching, not with force, but with presence. A single awakened soul in the middle of noise becomes a tuning fork. It doesn't argue, it resonates. It doesn't convince, it reminds. It doesn't dominate, it invites. That is what you now are. An invitation in human form. And this is what makes this technique not only powerful but feared, not by the light, but by the systems built on forgetting. Because when you remember, you cannot be bought. You cannot be manipulated. You stop participating in stories that no longer feel like truth. You stop identifying with the role. You begin to play the part with awareness, but your feet never leave the ground of your soul. And now, the question arises, how do I stay here? The answer is not complex. You stay through simplicity. You stay through ritual presence. You stay by remembering that everything, yes, everything can become a doorway, and if approached with attention, drinking water becomes sacred. Listening to a friend becomes ceremony. Placing your feet on the earth becomes remembrance. You no longer need to escape into far-off practices. The practice is you. The technique is no longer something you do, it is something you are becoming. But do not mistake this for a destination. The soul doesn't stop unfolding. Remembrance is not a peak. It is a rhythm, a lifelong dance between clarity and forgetting, rising and returning. And every return takes you deeper. So when the noise comes again, and it will breathe, when you feel distant from your center, pause. When you forget, smile gently at your forgetting, and choose again. This is the grace of the path. It is always waiting. It doesn't punish. It doesn't withdraw. It simply waits for your yes. And now, perhaps more than ever, the world needs your remembrance, not as a voice shouting, but as a presence radiating, as a light held calmly in dark rooms, as a vibration that reminds others of the stillness they forgot they had. You are not here to convince the world of truth. You are here to become it. So what now? You live. You carry your soul into each breath. You walk as one who has met themselves. You listen as one who no longer fears the silence. You love not to find completion, but because you've remembered you are love. And when others ask, what changed? You won't need to explain. They will feel it, because remembrance speaks louder than words. And this is the quiet revolution. One awakened soul at a time. One life lived from essence. One breath offered in presence. You've reached the end of the path, only to find it was never a path at all. It was a circle, a spiral, a homecoming. So now, the final instruction. Return. Return not because you're broken, but because you're whole. Return not because you are lost, but because you are found. Return not to something new, but to something eternal. You are not here to learn. You are here to remember, and that remembering has already begun. You didn't find this message by accident. If something inside you stirred, if even for a moment you've already begun to remember, in a world that thrives on distraction, your quiet awareness is an act of rebellion. The most powerful revolution is not loud, it is the awakening of a single soul that can no longer be controlled. Now is the time. Return to your center. Let go of what was never truly yours. Live, speak, and walk from the vibration of who you really are. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for certainty. The spark is already in you, ignite it. If this resonated with you, subscribe to this channel and share it with those who are ready to remember. Together, not through force, but through presence, we awaken the world one soul at a time. This isn't the end. It's your beginning.